data in that way before, and it tends to come up with, because this is a real live system, it tends to come up with the PHI included. So is everyone okay with that? Then it moves into quality improvement, which is, okay, I'm the division director, I want to sort of decide on, let me look at all the diabetics in the system, how many have hemoglobin A1Cs, but I'm really not doing it for research. At this point, I'm doing it mostly for internal process improvement. And then when does it become clearly research? And when does an investigator have to get IRB approval to do that? When do they have to disclose their intent for what they're doing? And it really, right now, it's very much, I think, focused on the culture and the expectations of the faculty, which, for the last 10 years it's been theoretical, and now it's real. And we're going to have to come up with the clear policies for that to be done safely. Meaningful use, we all know is there. I personally think that, most of what we do in clinical research would count as meaningful use for the EMR, and I think we would be an easy win on that side. Data on diagnosis is still most problematic, and to some extent. And after I put that, I was like, well, how does it go? Because you can search the record, you can find lots of people with listed diagnosis, but do people really accept that, do the researchers really accept that that is the true diagnosis? And, so you end up excluding a lot of cases. What's a little funny is you may get to this very pure group of let's again use the diabetes example, a very pure group of diabetics because they're on the medication, they've had it for 5 or 10 years. But that's only 5% of the people with diabetes in the system, and that potentially takes away what's the value of the EMR, which gives you that broad view of everybody that may have the condition of interest. So people are struggling with that. And then missing data on long-term outcomes. And that is, a function of the American multi-insurance environment. But it becomes the real issue. So we have plenty of data at Hopkins, and it's a big system, and we've followed them for 5 years, but then they disappear and they have sudden death at home or whatever it is, and you don't have complete data on that. And it really does limit the utility of the data set. Now, I thought I'd talk a little bit, challenges for researchers conducting interactive clinical research. And I use that term because so that would be the clinical trial. Let's just take the standard clinical trial of a new medication being done at Johns Hopkins. So this is where we really get back to that recruiting research participants. Mining the medical records to find the appropriate people for a trial is certainly now possible. And I think we have to determine what's the added utility of that with the time. And because, again, remember, what we know is the most successful way to recruit somebody into a study is it's based on their perception of the reputation of the institution and whether their doctor asks them to join a study. A mining approach, a letter, you might be interested, doesn't sort of fill that. We're going to have to see what is the added value of that. Of course, internet solutions, you might see there's lots of companies out there and others trying to get into that space, particularly allowing, say, searches of any medical records that they might have in Google Health or Microsoft Health Vault. And again, I think part of that is going to be what's the perception of the public to those type of solutions, those requests. And for a place like Johns Hopkins, is the value of getting patients that way worth the potential risk to the reputation if people believe that their data is too freely available? We're hoping, I think you're going to see a lot of work in this area. We need much better evaluations about the real added value of it, though. But I'm sure you're going to see many institutions trying to go that way, as well as pharma. Multi-center trials. The reason why I mentioned this is multi-center. So research teams need to enter data for both the local environment and the coordinating center. And we just do not have the standards involved for that. They're going to have to report some of the data to a web-based coordinating center. But the reality is that there's real patient management things that have to be done in the local environment. I mentioned to you about the clinical research billing. So from Hopkins' point of view and from each academic center's point of view, that's where they have huge liability, and you can put all the data you want to the National Coordinating Center, but we need to know what's happening within the local environment too, and that leads to a lot of inefficiencies in terms of the data management for each research team. Clinical research management systems are being developed for many academic institutions now, that when they're done well are linked to an electronic IRB, a link to the EMR, linked to the investigational drug service. We have one and others. I think they're going to be very useful. But again, I do point out the fact that for a research team, they're saying, well, somebody at the National Coordinating Center is doing a lot of this management too, so why do we need to do this? So the clinical research management systems are excellent to support investigator-initiated single-site studies, but for the growing number of multi-center site studies, we're concerned. And I mentioned this billing of sponsors insurance for services related to clinical research. What you really need is, and what we've been working through, is an interface that is a good representation of all the services that are available in a clinical trial and how that intersects with billing systems, the myriad billing systems out there, so you can pick out which of, so just to the context, at Hopkins, we're spending about $5 million a year right now just in being compliant on billing. And it means we have a group review it, you represent it, but then we have a group that reviews every bill that goes out from somebody that is in a clinical study at Johns Hopkins, because we don't have any way to clearly interface with the billing systems to automate that process. Clinical research IT challenges. The leadership of clinical research IT within medical centers, and I think we see that across the board with all of the work being done in IT, which is focused more on patient care. Who is the group, who is that person that is the voice for clinical research, and who's that person that is really making sure that in terms of choices that are made on IT solutions, that the clinical researcher, isn't left out of it. And that's one of the things that we've seen in the Clinical Research Forum IT Roundtable is evolution of more systems, more procedures and mechanisms for the research community to have an impact on the decisions. And that's been very important for us at Hopkins, to have someone that reports both to me and to the CIO of the institution. And it's really made a big difference in the last few years in terms of making sure that researchers' needs are met. Balancing innovation and research and need for enterprise-wide solutions. It's a classic. A lot of research is one-on-one. It's not automated. Everything is new, and finding that right balance of enterprise solution and allowing the innovation and research is a clear challenge. And then I think the last point is just the reality of clinical research involves research participant patients, research teams, sponsors, all working together to be efficient. And those are multiple interlocking parties that come together for one study, disappear, come together for another study, and it is a challenge to the efficiency of the process at Hopkins. Just in terms of summary, the opportunities for IT support of clinical research have never been greater, and I do mean that because we have the ability, we have much better data sets, we have integrating possibilities. Research participants and research staff have some ambivalence toward the promise of integrated research clinical systems, and maybe we can talk about that later. Every time I say, isn't this great that it's an interactive system and you can find out in your clinical system if someone's on a research study, there's a good minority that says, well, why do we want to do that? Research is a promise of extra confidentiality. And I think we have to work at that. And the last thing, I think it's essential over the next few years that we demonstrate the value of some integrated IT solutions for advancing knowledge, because right now people see the risks and sometimes the benefits are kind of abstract and in the future, and we need to really create this value that they see so that it makes it worth it for them to balance any risk. Thank you.
Dan, thank you very much for that presentation from the academic perspective. I'm now going to turn it over to Greg Downing for his 15 minutes of fame here to present his ideas on this particular topic. Greg, thanks for joining us.
I didn't know there was fame involved in this, Steve. I would prefer not to.
I had to lighten it up a little bit,
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back here, actually, and congratulations on your anniversary at NEHC. I represent a number of stakeholders within the federal government space that have involved and have interest in the advancement of health IT and the interfaces with clinical research overall. And I think to follow on to the real perspectives of what a powerhouse clinical investigative systems that Dan has, and countered also with what Steve will present, that this is a bit of a bureaucrat's view of the opportunity that's at hand, but somewhat of an impassioned plea to take a greater stride for advancing the capabilities that we have. I think there are three things that have changed in terms of the... there you go. Great. Here's a snapshot of one of the few things that I'd like to talk about this morning in terms of the broad panoply of things that come together in this context of clinical research. I would like to talk a little bit about some of the advancements in standards activities across the health IT space to accommodate clinical research, some elements that we discussed here approximately a year ago with regard to the uses of EHRs to support clinical research in a workgroup activity sponsored as a public-private activity through ANSI, and give you an update on the progress from that, and addressing core research data element capabilities and some of the next steps that we have envisioned going forward. I think there are three things that really change the scope and perhaps that enhance the cadence of interest in this. One is principally the vision towards the adoption of a greater deployment of IT technologies. And for those who have viewed sort of the clinical research informatics developing aside and apart from health IT dissemination in the healthcare delivery system, there's an opportunity here that previously hadn't been recognized by the ability to look at untapped potential for data from clinical care services to now be integrated in various ways to accommodate answering new questions in a knowledge engineering approach to healthcare changes that are coming. The second is a greater attention to the role of the patient in controlling information about themselves and their engagement in using innovative approaches to participate in clinical research activity. And I think the third thing is that obviously the investments and the changes brought about in high-tech and the Recovery Act provide new opportunities, whether it's through comparative effectiveness research, the substantial investments in EHR research activities that NIH has brought, and obviously the activities of ONC. There are many aspects of this that are unfolding across the federal government, and it's very difficult to characterize all of those today. I wanted to start with a general definition of clinical research because this can sometimes be one of the challenges in talking about it is what are we really speaking about? Is it clinical trials? Is it observational research? And this is a definition that is widely used by NIH and others in the federal government. The patient-oriented research is research conducted with human subjects or on material of human origin, such as tissues, specimens, and cognitive phenomena, in which a researcher directly interacts with human subjects. And the categories in which this is typically described are in epidemiology, behavioral and outcomes research, health services research, research on mechanisms of human disease, therapeutic interventions, clinical trials, and development of new technologies, but does not include in vitro studies using human tissues not linked to that of a living individual. And some of the new context, for example, that's coming into play, as Dan mentioned, is in comparative effectiveness research, where the robust capabilities of distributed health IT systems that can talk with each other provide new opportunities to answer vexing clinical questions, particularly those involving long-term outcomes data. Just some data trying to characterize what's the scenario like today, and this is rapidly changing, is that approximately 60% of trials today are still collected on paper, and if not that, require the interfaces to pull data from one information system and enter it into another.